Welcome to Duchamp and Picasso, Two Men and a Bicycle, a witty title that I did not invent. My name is Jerry Saltz. I'm an art critic. I'll be your moderator. You won't be hearing much from me today. I hope to act more like an invisible umpire, getting medieval on them if they go over time. I hate people that just start rambling, so they should stop me in a minute, as I do it all the time. Why Picasso and Duchamp? I mean, you love them. I love them. I've hated them. You've hated them. Why on earth would we be talking about these two gigantic artists, undeniably huge, and not say, well, Picasso has been paired with everybody, right? Picasso and Braque, Picasso and Matisse, Picasso and Iberia, Picasso and Kent presents, you know. So that's, you know, Duchamp, come on. Love him, hate him, everybody's like, oh, bicycle wheel, the urinal. I've always thought of him as one of the most religious, conservative artists who ever lived, obeying God's second commandment, thou shalt not make unto thee any graven images or sculptures hewn of stone, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. God said that, not me. Which means, of course, that God knew there were other gods. But more important, he didn't want his people to make things. And Duchamp was the first artist in making the first ready-made to follow that. That God had made it, in a sense, that the world had created it, and he just said, I point at the thing of the world. And that became a gigantic stream of DNA. To finish, I would only say that it's famous that Duchamp, I think, said Picasso was wrong. And you know, whatever, that's like saying Seurat was wrong. You know, I don't know, Tintoretto is wrong. Okay, but I would only add, as a lover of both of them, as you are, that there would be no Duchamp without Cubism and Picasso and collage. So let's keep our priorities straight here and know that we are arguing about our passions here. Well, I have two heavyweights at 5'9" and 159 for Picasso. I have one of the great Picasso scholars, Pepe Carmel. Let's hear it up. Give it up. And here at, is it 5'11"? I lie, I'm 5'11". At 180?
Yes.
Yeah. I'm just feeling it's 180. I just hugged him. I could feel that. A man who I wrote crawled deeper into the Duchamp wormhole that anybody else has ever crawled into. I give you the heavyweight, the one, the only Francis Naumann. Mr. Naumann will speak for 15 minutes. I'll give him a 1-minute warning, saying the round is almost over, dude. And then we will hear from Pepe Carmel, speaking for 15 minutes. I know Pepe, I may not have to give him a warning, but I will. And then I'm hoping that you all will ask them questions and get medieval on them. One thing, we only take questions here. Don't get up and make a long statement, okay? That's always the most depressing part. A panel goes okay, and then some psychotic in the audience gets up and makes an 8-minute statement about, like, you know, that's him. That's him. I can tell. I've got my eye on you. All right, so I'm really grateful that you came this early, and I'm awestruck by Kent Presents. I've done one of these Aspen things and others. In its first year ever, it's better. And many people I'm looking in this room help Ben and Donna Rosen. Sort of in the background, I really give you a gigantic shout out. And of course, I see Donna Rosen here. Thank you. Thanks for ruining our summer. You've ruined the summer. Okay. Well, yeah, you're awake. Okay. Sorry to take the first 10 minutes already. I've ruined the panel.
Jerry, you have 1 more minute.
Okay. That's good. I told you. Francis Naumann, please.
Thanks, Jerry. I hate to nitpick like this, but you made a big mistake in that introduction. You said that Picasso that Duchamp made the remark that Picasso was wrong. He didn't. Duchamp never would say such a thing. Picasso said that about Duchamp, that Duchamp was wrong. It's a very important distinction, actually. When thought through, we'll come back probably to it later on. But first, I wanted to put the two protagonists up. You can advance the next image. There's Picasso on the left, Duchamp on the right. They're in photographs both by Arnold Newman. The one on the left, the Picasso image, is in 1954. He's 73 years old there. And Duchamp is in 1966, and he's 79 years old. He'll live only 2 more years. And I thought I could look at these pictures and maybe derive some of the differences between these two artists. But you can do anything you want when you read a picture. And Picasso is this classical giant. But the interesting thing about Arnold Newman is he lets Picasso put his hand up to his forehead as if he's thinking. Picasso certainly had the ability to think, especially visually. And I think that's the real difference between these two artists. One was a great titan of visual thought, and the other one was just a great titan of thought. And it's a distinction that we have, over time, come to think about ourselves differently. I wanted to mention that this subject, the reason that we took on this subject to begin with, is that it's a pretty hot topic now. It certainly wasn't when I first became interested in Duchamp, and I, with some embarrassment, have to admit that happened almost 50 years ago. It was 1966 when I was a student in high school, and my life completely changed when I first saw the works of Duchamp. But it has become a subject now. And there are 2 books on this subject. One is this one by a journalist named Larry Whitman out of Baltimore, called Picasso and the Chess Player. Of course, the chess player is Duchamp. And the premise of this book begins by saying that there was a rivalry between these 2 artists from the get-go. And that's not really true at all. There was no rivalry whatsoever. It didn't really happen until Duchamp became appreciated by great artists like Johns and Rauschenberg and Cunningham and Cage in the 1960s. That's when it started to happen. There was no rivalry before that. But there was enough attention paid to Duchamp in that last decade of his life for Picasso to have come to this conclusion that he was wrong. Anyway, advance the next slide, because I won't get far. Oh, do I? I can do it? Well, let him do it. This is the classic comparison. It's a comparison made by art historians ever since they knew that these subject matter methodology approaches work. I'm not sure it works all that much. It's because it's a bicycle wheel on one side, and the other one on the left has the still life with chair caning. They both incorporate elements from this real world, but for completely and totally different reasons. Clement Greenberg said that he had no idea why they kept paying so much attention to Duchamp, because Picasso was first. Because the still life with chair caning dates from 1912, and the bicycle wheel is 1913. So he wondered why you would even bother talking about this difference. But the differences are way more than just the difference between apples and oranges. They're huge. They're differences that break the century apart, really. You know, there are 2 ways of thinking. It was actually de Kooning who first said that he didn't know what train he was on as an artist, but he hoped he was on the train with Duchamp. It was a kind of interesting way and a metaphor to use, because the century does split. It goes in one direction. Either you accept Duchamp or you don't. And what I have found that's absolutely remarkable is that for those people who accept Duchamp, they can also look at Picasso and appreciate him. But the people who have only accepted Picasso can't see any value in Duchamp, with present company excluded, because Pepe does. But it's almost like, as a Democrat, I can see some value in what the Republicans are saying. I don't think they see anything in what I'm saying. It's like it's a one-way street. I hate to break it down to politics, but anyway, next two images. Now, there are two books devoted to the subject of Picasso and Duchamp. Another one was a catalog for an exhibition at the Moderne Musette, both of them last year, the one that's entitled He Was Wrong. And both of these books neglect to actually talk about the interrelationship of these two artists. It's unbelievable that a book that's like 250 pages doesn't really talk, it's just running two lives parallel to one another and coming to certain conclusions about what happened at certain moments in their life. But it doesn't really tackle the issue of how they interrelated. And just before, well, a few years before Duchamp died, he was asked this question. He said, about Picasso, and he said, oh yeah, I knew him. He was part of the circle of artists that I met, and he sort of dismissed it at that. But there were 2 points of real intersection with these artists that I'd like to talk about. And the first one is never, until recently, been talked about at all, though I knew about it many years ago. I don't know if you can see these images. That's the Armory show on the left, 1913, the big exhibition in which both Picasso and Duchamp were included. That's the new Descending a Staircase that, of course, stole the attention of all other pictures in the show. But what you can hardly see there on the extreme right is a list in Picasso's hand of the artists who should be included in the Armory show. Walt Kuhn, one of the organizers of the show, traveled to Paris in the fall, and we can even narrow it down to the last 4 days of October in 1912, in preparation for the Armory show, which, remember, is only going to take place a few months later in New York. And he asked Picasso who should be included in the show. And you see the list. It begins with Messenger. Well, he's got Juan Gris at the top, Messenger, and about the 5th person down, there's Duchamp. He didn't bother with the P. You don't pronounce it anyway. So he's recommending that Duchamp be included in that show, the very show that, at least for an American audience, the attention wasn't toward Cubism, but in the end, toward that one painting. That wasn't Duchamp's fault, or for that matter, even Picasso's. It was the American public misunderstanding that picture from the get-go. But that's another story, too. Now, if you advance the next slide, this is another exhibition held 12 years later in New York City. And it's an exhibition organized by an artist whose name I mentioned in another session earlier, Catherine Dreyer. She had all of the paintings in the collection of the Société Anonyme. Duchamp was a member of that organization with Man Ray. They established it, they founded it. And a few years later, they wanted to have an exhibition that gathered all these modern artists from around the globe. And that was the critical concern. They wanted them from around the globe. They wanted them represented internationally to show that this idea of modernism had spread all over the planet. And the catalog was divided into categories by countries, not by artists, but by the countries the artists came from. And appropriately, Picasso's in there under Spain in this case. And Duchamp's in there under France, and you can see that his large glass, the major work that he worked on from 1915 to 23, is there in that picture in the lower right corner, exhibited in the galleries in front of paintings by Léger, Van Doesburg, and that's the cover of the catalog on the left. I just put that in there. Now, the reason I show this picture is because in the year prior to the opening of this exhibition, Duchamp was very much assisting Catherine Dreyer to find pictures to be included. And in a letter that he wrote to Catherine Dreyer, she wrote to him presumably saying, well, what can we find of Picasso? And he wrote back, he didn't think that it was necessary to put in the work of artists who were already well marketed. And that was a kind of interesting distinction. Here Picasso is advising his inclusion in the Armory show, and then 12 years later, Duchamp saying, well, maybe it's better you don't include this guy. But what few people seem to understand about Duchamp, everybody jumps to the conclusion, yes, he made it ready-made, so now everything can be art. That wasn't his motive initially. That may be the way we now look at it and look at history, but that's not what he was wanting to do. He really invented ready-mades for not necessarily to challenge all art and art history, but to challenge the system of art that made certain artists famous and others not. You know, his new Descending a Staircase, he said was a turning point in his artistic career. It wasn't because of the picture intrinsically. It was because that picture was rejected from an exhibition in Paris just after it was painted in 1912 by his brothers, by fellow Cubists. They thought it was inappropriate for, he said in interviews later in life, because of the nudity alluded to in the title. I don't think it was so much that, because it was Glaise and Messenger who forced his brothers to cause them to approach him and ask him for the withdrawal of the picture. They told him they could substitute it for another one if he wanted to, but he didn't want to. That might have been the single greatest act of genius in his life, because he said to himself, I don't need to be like my brothers. I don't have to go home and please them and get another picture in here. He just withdrew. He totally withdrew. He withdrew from the art system, not just the artists who were in it. And he had no reason to hate his brothers for this. I mean, it wasn't them personally, but he realized that there was a bigger system controlling everything. It was actually the first person to point this out publicly recently was Jed Pearl, who's a very conservative writer for the, is it New Republic or something like that? And generally, I don't like anything he says, but in this case, he wrote a brilliant article on the Koons show at the Whitney, where he basically said that this comparison with Duchamp is a false comparison because, you know, yes, okay, they look at objects that already exist and maybe introduce them as works of art, and they both maybe share that in common, but Duchamp was doing something much more. He was attacking the art system. And Jed Pearl's conclusion to that article is that, unfortunately, Jeff Koons is the art system. And it was a good point to have made, I think. Okay, next two slides. How long do I have?
4 minutes.
Good. Next two slides, I can put them up, because this is also an interesting distinction between the two artists. When that show was being organized at the Brooklyn Museum, that took place in 1926, earlier, only 3 months earlier, there was an exhibition of work from the collection of John Quinn, the famous New York lawyer who had amassed, well, if it stayed together, it would have been the single greatest collection of modernism ever, but anyway, it was dispersed upon his death, and there were a series of auctions held. Well, Duchamp was organizing a Brancusi show and happened to be passing through New York, so he went to the auction, and he bought a work by Picasso. It's the work on the left, the head of the man on the left. What's amazing about this purchase is that it's listed in the catalog as attributed to Picasso, which I can't get over. I mean, I know you couldn't pick up a phone and call him, but you can get a letter to him maybe on time to ask if he did this thing. And why it was attributed, I don't know. But whatever the reasons for it is, he paid $45 for this drawing. And then, shortly after that, he goes back to Paris. He privately purchased the other drawing from the Quinn estate that wasn't in the catalog. He brings them both back to Paris, and Catherine Dreyer starts writing to him saying, can I buy those Duchamp drawings? He says, no, you can't buy them from me, but you can maybe buy them from auction, because I'm putting them at auction. So before the end of the year, 3 months later, they sold for about $400. He told each. So he took his $45 investment and turned it into $400 when it was a sizable amount thing to do. So remember what he said to Catherine Dreyer. He didn't want Picasso included in that show because he was already successfully marketed. Well, Duchamp surely knew that and took advantage of it and actually bought something and resold it. He never had anything against dealers in the art market, but he had a real hatred for money infiltrating it into itself into his work. And that can, if you can advance the next two, I don't try this because I'll mess up. Keep going because Pepe's going to show those. And keep going one more after that. Yeah, there. If there's a great arbitrator of the differences between these two artists, in the end, you could look at it as money. And there is something that really is quite severely different about the two, and that is the value of the work. That's the Picasso on the left that sold for the $156 million, and next to it is Duchamp's urinal. If one were available on the market tomorrow, you know, they've been evaluated, one sold. I used to own a Duchamp urinal. My whole life would change if I held on to that, but I very wisely paid $25,000 and sold it for $45,000. It has sold since for $11 million, but one that would come on the market now could be maybe 50, maybe 100 million. So, but it still isn't 156 million. And that's the single most important work by Duchamp. If you used this, well, Pepe will talk about it, or did in the plenary session, that there was a review among art historians and critics in England, and they judged that work to be the single most influential work of the 20th century. And even great Picasso experts would not judge that painting to be his greatest masterpiece. There are many that would be ahead of it. So money in the end is something we can talk about, and it'll come up later. And since I occasionally buy work by Duchamp and try to sell it, I can tell you that it's an uphill battle. There's a very thin number of people at the top who want to buy Duchamp, because art for everyone is a visual experience, period. You know, when someone looks at a work of art, they want to just look at it. That's all they want to do. If you force that person to go 2 inches behind their eyeballs and think about it, you're violating them. And to many people, Duchamp is considered a violation, and a serious one, and one that has impacted his market. Also, of course, he produced so little. Picasso produced a lot. So over time, I call it the snowball effect. If I own a work by Picasso from 1932, I put it at auction. Well, I'm going to want more than whatever that other 1932 work sold for the year. Good. So it's a kind of, and with Duchamp, there's no snowball. There's nothing. There's not enough work out there to make it grow in value over time, because he made sure that every work that he produced went into a single collection. And that's the Arnsberg collection in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. So the lion's share, the majority of what he produced is all in one place. What he did allow for were multiples that kind of sneak out, and also increasingly they go up in value over time. There's no question about that, because I can't even buy them anymore. And the urinal was produced in an edition, after all, of 8 signed and numbered examples. So that's certainly out of my reach, and maybe the reach even of you guys. Anyway, I think, also I'll get to this later, but I think that too little is paid for art, even at the rate of 156 million, because there are billionaires out there.
I think we're going to stop.
And we're going to, but that's actually, he's right. He's right.
No, okay. Good. That was fantastic. Pepe Carmel, please.
Well, Francis, before you sit down, everyone has to see this amazing tie, which is a detail from a Duchamp painting. So. Hi there. Let me pick up on something Francis just said and recapitulate a little what I said at the plenary session, which is one of the starting points for this panel was a 2004 poll conducted by the Tate Gallery, at which a bunch of artists and critics and curators in England voted that Duchamp's fountain or urinal was the single most important artwork of the 20th century, outpacing Picasso's Demoiselle and paintings by Matisse and so forth. And a lot of people were kind of set back on their heels by this idea. And more broadly, you might argue that the art world today, particularly contemporary art, is divided by a kind of invisible line, or maybe not so invisible. The kind of art that is inspired by Duchamp, that is conceptual, that is in your face, that is subverting what we think about art, that is giving the finger to the system, and the kind of art that is still painting or sculpture in some recognizable way that you can enjoy simply for its beauty, that maybe you don't have to go 2 inches behind the eyeballs, as Francis was just saying. So what I want to do in the next 14 and a half minutes is 14 minutes, is to explore not simply the Duchamp-Picasso rivalry, but some of the reasons why people have, over time, rejected Picasso. I mean, Francis just referred to the fact that Duchamp thought he was too successful by the 1920s, and that was a widely shared opinion, that he was a crowd pleaser. So let me go to the first, I have a button. Which one? Does it work?
Can you guys advance it further?
Yeah, I think you guys had better do it. It's too high tech. Thank you. Okay, so what you're looking at here on the left is one of these classic breakthrough Cubist works. This is a 1913 painting modeled on a papier-collé, head of a girl. It's in the Centre Pompidou, and as you can see, Picasso has thrown out the Renaissance paradigm of art, and instead it's broken up into abstract signs and purely geometric forms, and you have to kind of figure out that it's a head of a girl. You don't see it there. Now, this is the kind of revolutionary picture that artists, including Duchamp, were inspired by. On the right is a Picasso from 1921, a neoclassical picture, a woman in blue, actually not a gouache, a pastel. Was shown at the Frick a few years ago. Shown at the Frick. Picasso? What? So you could argue, if you were in a grumpy mood, that this is a return to the kind of most vacuous parts of the Renaissance or the classical tradition. It's that big kind of inflated face of the Medici Venus. It's the pretty colors of Guido Reni. In other words, this picture on the right, the 1921 picture, seems to take back everything that the 1913 picture has to say. The 1913 picture says, revolution in the art world, and the one on the right says, actually, let's relax and make some more pretty pictures. And there were people at the time, like Picasso's former partner, Brock, who dismissed him as being a kind of magician who was just a crowd pleaser. More recently, art historians like Rosalind Krauss have said, well, Picasso just becomes a pastiche, everything after 1914 is completely worthless, or many things after 1914. So this is one of those turning points in the reaction to Picasso. Now, Ben Rosen had asked if we could use that clicker technology, which is available in the other rooms, and turns out not available in this room, and I can't even make this clicker work. But let me ask you for a show of hands, in fact. Which movement do you think is more important, Cubism or Neoclassicism? Let me see hands for Cubism. Who thinks Cubism is really, really important? Okay. Who thinks Picasso's Neoclassicism is really important? Thank you, you brave people. Good. Okay, now, second question. Which picture would you rather have in your living room? And to pick up on what Francis and Jerry have been saying, for some of you, this might be a real possibility. You lucky people. Which one would you rather have in your living room? How many would rather have the Cubist Picasso? Okay, it's an advanced crowd. How many would rather have the neoclassical picture? Ah, more hands go up. Francis, there we go. Thank you. I mean, there is a little contradiction here in the way we feel about modern art. You go to the museum, you read about things, you'll want to be very daring. But you know, if you had to live with it, you really want this thing in your face all the time. This, I think, is part of why Duchamp is important. So that brings me to the next comparison. If you could advance, please. Thank you. So here's Duchamp's great LHOOQ, which, as you all recall, is a dirty pun. And Francis just turned up this great document where Duchamp wrote a letter explaining it for an American guy? Yeah. An American guy who didn't get the pun, but just to tell you what you already know, these are just seem to be letters, but if you say LHOOQ, it sounds like it's saying she's got a hot ass. So this is a verbal attack on the Mona Lisa, but also the mustache is like a cheap graffiti gesture of attacking the Mona Lisa. So this is not a formally innovative picture. It's just taking something we know and making some scratches on it, but it is attacking all of our ideas, all of our, hallowed assumptions about what is great art. And this kind of thing had a big impact at the time, not just Duchamp alone, but the sense that modern art was an outrageous attack on everything that people believed in. There's a wonderful essay that the Spanish philosopher José Ortega y Gasset published around 1925 called The Dehumanization of Art. And for him, for Ortega, Cubism and Dada were really just two versions of the same thing. Picasso attacked humanity with a cube, as you see on the left. Duchamp attacked it with a mustache, but they both had the same goal of the dehumanization of art. Now, if that's your goal, if that's what you're trying to do, maybe the Duchamp is the more effective work because it's so aggressive, because it doesn't get distracted by formal questions. And just to pick up on something I said at the outset, this is really the great parting of the ways in modern art. So with one stream, we go from Cubism to other kinds of abstraction, Mondrian, Malevich, later on to Frank Stella, and so forth. In the other stream, we go from Duchamp famously to Rauschenberg and Johns, and more recently in the 80s with postmodernism, you all recall Sherry Levine and Chaim Steinbach and Ashley Bickerton, all the people who said, you just take something and you stick it on a shelf or a pedestal, or you put a brand name label out there, and that's the art. More recently in contemporary art, you have artists like the great Mexican Gabriel Orozco, Damien Hirst, a shark in a tank. That's a work of art? Well, yes, if you are buying into the Duchampian paradigm, Maurizio Catalan, and then, of course, most famously, as we've already discussed, Jeff Koons. And I'm sure you all remember that astonishing room at the Whitney retrospective where you came off the elevator and there were those cases, the plexiglass cases with the vacuum cleaners lined up in them, the light shining as though, they were religious relics. It was this, I mean, I talked to Scott Rothkopf, who curated the show, and he, really gave a tremendous amount of thought about making this beautiful kind of sacred installation of these everyday objects. I mean, this is the direct lineal descendant of the fountain or the urinal. And of course, there's still a lot of debate in the art world about Jeff Koons. So something that is provocative all these decades later, an idea that keeps on being provocative, has got to be a pretty great idea. So let me ask you another trick question. Let's say that we very crudely could divide ourselves into those who are basically in favor of the status quo and those who are basically in favor of creative destruction, which incidentally is not a phrase from the art world. It's a phrase from the Austrian economist Joseph Schumpeter, which has been quoted in a lot of discussions of the economy in the last 10 or 15 years. We're suffering through creative destruction right now. But let's do, okay, status quo, creative destruction. How many of you see yourself as basically in favor of the status quo? Hands, please. Again, I admire you brave people. How many of you see yourselves as in favor of creative destruction? Yes, right, good. Okay, now, again, same dumb question. What would you rather have in your living room? Picasso's Cubist painting or Duchamp's? Which of these? Okay, how many want the Picasso? Okay, how many want the Duchamp? Yes, okay, well,
Francis wants that one.
Francis's vote counts for 2 or 3. Even with that, there was, I believe, a majority of hands in favor of the Picasso. So what happened to all of you creative destruction partisans? Why weren't you out there voting for Duchamp? Really, don't, put your hands where your beliefs are. Okay, excuse me? You're abstaining. Okay, Roberta, fine. So,
This question is coming from my wife.
right. Okay, let me go to the third comparison. How am I doing on time, Jerry?
You have 5 minutes.
Okay, great. I'll talk faster. No, that's a bad idea. So I also wanted to bring in a political dimension to this, another way in which, or example of how people didn't like Picasso or turned against what he represented. And what we're looking at here on the right now, I'm sorry, this is kind of hard to see, in part because it's a little screen, but also because all we have is a photograph of a long-lost collage. This is a collage that was done as a collaboration between George Grosz and John Hartfield, the 2 Berlin Dadaists. It was shown at the first Dada Fair of 1920 in Berlin, was reproduced in the catalog, which is why we have the photograph, but the original has been lost. And this is their attack on Picasso. As you can see, they've taken the painting on the left, the one from the Pompidou, and added new elements and written on it. It's a little bit like Duchamp and the mustache and the caption on the Mona Lisa, only now they're attacking Picasso. And even the title of the work, it's called La Vie Heureuse, the Happy Life, Corrected Picasso. They did a series in this catalog of corrected paintings, like, well, no, that's not right. We're going to show you what it really should look like. But their correction consists of introducing photographs, self-portraits, of giving it a kind of political meaning. As you know, Berlin in 1920 was in the midst of a tremendous upheaval of left-wing attacks on the government, extreme right-wing responses that led some years later to the rise of Nazism. Very highly charged situation. And if we could go to the next slide, please. This is a view of that exhibition, the first International Dada Fair, and it'll give you some sense of the politicization of art at the moment, rather, you might say, like the Venice Biennial right now, but not so much in Venice. Notice floating from the ceiling this stuffed mannequin with a pig's face in a military uniform hanging there where everyone can see it, It's an attack on the symbols of authority, of order, of nationalism, all these things that were held sacred by many members of the German nation who were deeply crushed by losing the war. There's a sign on the back wall in German that says, "Dilettantes, rise up against art." This is the Dada attitude. They want to show the horror and the absurdity of the culture and the society that led to World War I. And for them, the very idea of art is implicated in everything that had gone wrong and led to the war. Can I go backwards to the previous slide, please? So coming back to their collage, they are attacking the virtues, not the defects of Picasso, but the virtues of Picasso. The ideas of genius or wholeness, integrated composition. They're attacking these things because they're reading them in political terms. Genius is a kind of symbol for political authority. Wholeness is a kind of symbol for social control. And they are against these things. They are against, Gross and Hartfield are against authority. They're against social control. And it's the very greatness of Picasso that makes him an attractive target. For them, in other words, Cubism as a pure, non-political style is just another way for the art world to carry on with business as usual, ignoring the horrors and injustices of the real world. Okay, now I'd like to go two forward, please.
1 minute remaining.
Okay, so here we have a comparison that Francis already alluded to, Duchamp's bicycle wheel, Picasso's bull's head. The bull's head is a triumph of imagination. Take two things you found, it's also kind of an assisted ready-made, and put them together. Who would have thought that this would make a bull's head? Isn't that fantastic? The bicycle wheel is just that. It doesn't symbolize anything. It's not a picture of anything, but it has a profound symbolic value. You could take it as an allegory for our own period of political spin. Duchamp used to sit there spinning the wheel around. The elections come and go, the wheels of the political system keep turning, but nothing fundamentally changes, or so it seems. There's a kind of gridlock, not of movement. So the Duchamp tells us this crisis, shows us this problem. You could argue that Picasso shows us a way out, or at least gives us a hope of transformation, that we can take what already exists and turn it into something different. I see it as an allegory of hope, which is why I'm a Picassoite, but everyone is free to disagree. Thank you.
Just before I ask you if you're jumping out of your skin because you might agree with Picasso as opposed to Duchamp or have other thoughts, I just wanted to very quick, while you might, I hope, thinking of questions. I heard two possible false distinctions between, on the one hand, the status quo and creative destruction. I'm going to ask you about that in a second. And then I'm going to ask you about the possible only feel, don't think. My thought always being that you can't look without feeling, you can't feel without thinking. That this false Platonic division into dichotomies seems very male to me. As a man, I say that. So first of all, instead of being status quo versus creative destruction, isn't it just making? Isn't it just art? Isn't it, everybody has a worldview, but why one versus the other? Couldn't there be 50 other things like I like orange?
Well, there's an infinite number of things that art can be, but I do think there's a fundamental difference of attitude towards the world that is then reflected in art, towards art that fundamentally says, life is good, life is beautiful, let me remind you how beautiful life is, and art that says, things are screwed up, things are a mess, we need to be more aware of what a mess things are, and I'm going to grind it in your face. And
but does Goya's Saturn eating his children only say something bad or good? Isn't it also an extraordinary painting?
It is an extraordinary painting, but to me at least, that makes it more painful to be reminded of the possibility of beauty while also being shown the cruelty, the possible inhumanity of man to man. But Yes, I mean this is the paradox of political art in general, is that it always ends up affirming. It starts out criticizing, and then ultimately, if it's good art, we decide it's beautiful, however outrageous, and then it ends up being an affirmation instead of a criticism.
Francis, can you divide thinking and feeling?
You can divide looking from feeling or thinking. And there are a lot of people who just look. They don't want to feel, they don't want to think.
There's
And
people
a lot of
who
people
doesn't
assume
want to feel.
There are a lot of people who look at art don't presume that it has to have that capability.
To
Unless
feel.
they're diehard romantics and they're looking for something like that, but they don't necessarily pre-conclude when they look at a work of art that they have to think or
Does
that they have to feel.
anybody here not want to feel when you're looking at a work of art? Does anybody here never want to think when they're looking at a work of art?
But look,
But that's his
there's-
point.
no,
That's his point.
The reason
that
I
this
said it, though,
divides
is
that way.
if you walk into a museum and you look at a bicycle and you're going to feel something, you're a lunatic. You can't. What are you going to feel? You're looking at a bicycle. That's ridiculous. But you can.
I feel things myself, but maybe I'm a lunatic.
But what are you feeling? That's like if you're. I think you can.
Jealousy, rage, I don't know. I hate my parents. I don't know.
I guess.
Okay,
but no, I meant that
that's-
if you look at something that's in the Museum of Modern Art, you look at something that's cubist. You can look for little cubes. You see something that's expressionist. You can look for moving things, or
I've
I
never
suppose
looked for little. Well,
or-
my wife, Roberta Smith,
Well-
is jumping out of her skin. What?
What's boring?
panel
Us or
is
your
boring?
question? I think your question.
You just can't make those kinds of pronouncements about people's experience. And you have to take into account that a lot of people have feelings and ideas that they aren't quite aware of, that they may not know how to articulate. What goes on between an artwork and a person, anyone really, is extremely complicated and involves your unconscious and your conscious. And what we do in the art world.
Talk into the mic, please.
What we do in the art world is try to articulate that in different ways in all that we do. But
Okay.
people don't choose how they react. And to think that things are sectioned off like that is really very limiting.
Can we let him answer? Because I don't want to stop your question because I'm scared now. But let's hear your answer.
I only meant it in the sense that people get preconditioned. If they go through the Museum of Modern Art and see those other things, they have ways of relating to them. After all, the word cubism's on the wall. You can look for cubes. You can do these things. You can look for bright colors in fauvism. But when you get to that room and there's a bicycle wheel in it and it says Dadaism, are you going to look for Da? That association, that thing you're looking for, is something that isn't visual anymore. It doesn't exist visually. It's something that has to be in your head.
Roberta's shaking
and you
her
could,
head.
and I agree with the fact that once it is in your head, well, you can have a lot of feelings, I suppose. I just meant the gut level, instinctive feeling of like looking at a beautiful, colorful Matisse and feeling that. I can feel that too. But I can't feel that same kind of sensation, that physical sensation, except in my head when I look at a bicycle wheel.
How about the tie you're wearing? Doesn't that give you pleasure? Tom?
It's the only.
Isn't it kind of extraordinarily visual?
What's remarkable about this detail in that painting is that Duchamp didn't paint it.
So cool by me.
Yeah.
Rubens didn't
he
paint
hired
a lot of his
someone
stuff.
else to
Any
paint it all together.
questions here?
Oh, Jerry, can I throw in
Yeah.
a story in
But
support?
we've got to let the audience in.
What?
Go
Okay,
ahead.
a quick story in support of Francis's distinction about thinking, feeling, people who don't want to do one or the other. Mel Bachner, the conceptual artist, told me some years back he had taken part in a competition to design a work of art that was supposed to go in a new lunchroom at the Institute for Advanced Studies near Princeton, and he did one of his pieces with series of numbers and so forth, and it lost. And he was talking to one of the super brilliant physicists there who said, well, I really, I voted against your piece. And Mel said, why? And he said, it made me think too much.
Okay.
So
That's a bummer. Okay, quick question. Stand up, please, and just fire away.
or give your name.
Give your name. Fire it away. Keep
My
it
name
a
is
question.
Judith Shulevitz. I have a question, as the only person who raised her hand in defense of the status quo, I have a question about that distinction. I wonder whether we haven't entered a period in which the status quo is actually creative destruction and that distinction no longer applies. In other words, in the political domain and in the economic domain, you know, in a society that is currently sort of very worshipful, for example, of the Silicon Valley ideology, we adore creative destruction. That's what we're always seeking, disruption. Disruption is good. And I think that's been true for quite some time in the art world as well, where, as Mr. Naumann was saying, you know, or yeah, it was Mr. Naumann who was saying that, you know, it was citing Jed Pearl's
And your
point.
question?
My question, good
I'm
point. Sorry about
because
that.
we only
My
have 5
question
minutes.
is, aren't we in a time also in the art world where the revolutionary is the status quo, and that the sort of a kind of traditionalism is what is despised?
Okay. Is the status quo the revolutionary, and how would that impact on one or the other of you answer, not both?
Well, since I showed the slide comparison, I mean, you're right. We are living in an era of creative disruption. But to me, and so maybe I should have used a different term, something that looks traditional, old-fashioned, reassuring. I mean, I wrote a whole book on Cubism. I'd rather have the 1921 picture in my house. It's sweet, it's beautiful, it's reassuring. Yes, the whole world is going crazy with creative disruption around me. But when I'm at home, I'd like a little peace and quiet.
Next question. Right here, sir. Stand up, say your name, and make it a question.
My name is Frank Delaney. How useful, if ever, is the market as a maker of verdicts?
How useful is
Well,
the market?
I would say it's completely irrelevant in this context,
Right.
because there is no market for Duchamp.
Except I
and-
would
and-
remind us that the $11 million urinal was bought by a young man named Larry Gagosian. So that makes you think, there's a market there.
I know a little more about the deal. He traded.
bet.
But I don't know what he traded. I'd love to know. If it was a Picasso, I'd love it. But I think it might
So
not have
the
been.
market buys what the market does. The market is a self-replicating organism. People in the market buy what other people in the market buy. That's what we know. They buy a lot of Picasso, so they buy more. The Picasso will end up in a private room where you'll never see it again. The Duchamp bicycle wheel or urinal or whatever just sold for less. I always tell my students, please make me the bicycle wheel and make me the Picasso bullhead out of the bicycle too. And none of them ever do. I don't know why. It'd be so easy.
I wanted to say one thing about those two items, which I pointed out to Pepe. The bullhead, the Picasso bullhead, hangs today in the Picasso Museum as a real handlebar and a bicycle seat. But Picasso didn't want that displayed that way. He produced it in an edition of 2 bronzes. And Claude Picasso said that's what he considered the final product. The other 2 were just lying around in the studio, and they had them and displayed them on the wall. That's a really important distinction.
I'd still
Because he-
want one.
You
Oh,
know,
I want one. Look,
I have to say, I wonder about that story, although, I mean, Claude has become the arbiter of everything that is or isn't Picasso. But Françoise Gillot, Claude's mother, in her book of memoirs, says that when Picasso was showing that to her, he said, you know, this will go in a museum, and he was referring to the original one. You know, I picked these things up out of the street, and I saw I could make a sculpture, and it'll go in a museum, and 1,000 years will go by, and the museum will fall to dust, and they'll just be lying there in the rubble, and someday someone who has a broken bicycle will come by and say, a handlebar, a seat, that's just what I needed, and put them back on his bicycle.
reuse them. Well, Duchamp did say you could, the
Speak up.
idea of a ready-made would be to switch the notion around and change a Rembrandt into an ironing board.
My favorite oh, please. Yes, I didn't see another question. Sir, stand up, state your name, and say your question. Jerry Weissman.
Breakthrough in creative destruction. What makes it happen?
What makes a great breakthrough in creative destruction happen? Big question. Anybody want to tackle it? No. There's somebody asking.
Wait, no, look, I mean,
stand up,
that
state your
deserves-
name, ask a question. What?
I'm sure you'll think this is a long shot, but from what I see people in my age range, my daughter's age range, they don't go to temple, they don't go to church, they're, but they line up in front of the art museums and the art galleries, and they're looking for something, an answer. And I think in creative destruction is what's next.
Okay.
They're showing
So-
the group what's next,
The-
but they
the
don't want to
never-
hang that in their house.
The never-changing changing. The ever-changing changing.
I think, let
Please.
me offer a response to the last two questions.
Yeah.
Which is, remember, it's creative destruction. It's not just destruction. The people who invent it's really hard to have a new idea in art. There's a lot of great art that isn't new. It's very few new ideas. It's really hard to have an idea like Steve Jobs did about Apple. Right.
Artists. PR. Bad.
Oh.
Very bad.
He's in PR.
Very bad. But I like you. You have a good first name. Then PR, I can't. Artists are the answer. And you guys,
I have
the fact that you might be frustrated, I always take as a great sign of a panel. And we're over time now. And I'm really grateful that you came and that you gave us your attention. Thank you.